In our final video in the series on synaptic regulation, we're going to look at the regulation of a different hormone than acetylcholine, which is this hormone here, known by its scientific name of epinephrine, although more commonly known as adrenaline. Now, adrenaline has entered popular media because most people understand that it is the hormone that regulates what we call the fight or flight emergency response, which is more correctly known as the sympathetic nervous system response. Now, there's a lot of misinformation in popular culture about what adrenaline actually does, so the main purpose of this video is in putting some of those popular myths to rest. But first, we can take a look at the mechanism of how adrenaline is regulated, because its mechanism of regulation remains relatively similar to that of acetylcholine, with one critical difference. Namely that as a steroid-based hormone, as we can see from the benzene ring here, adrenaline is most likely produced in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, where it is transported from the cell body to the synaptic cleft in synaptic vesicles like this. As action potential moves down the axon, it once again triggers the input of calcium ions from the outside of the neuron to the inside of the axon terminus, and those calcium ions mediate the exocytosis of adrenaline into the synaptic cleft like this. Now, just like acetylcholine, adrenaline is a very excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning that it causes the voltage-gated sodium channels on the postsynaptic neuron to open up, resulting in an increased flow of sodium ions into the postsynaptic neuron, thereby spreading action potential to the next neuron. The only difference, as mentioned before, is the way that adrenaline is actually suppressed. Firstly, adrenaline does not actually permanently attach itself to the receptor proteins that control the neurotransmitter-gated sodium channels on the postsynaptic dendrites, meaning that adrenaline can easily fall out of the receptor site, after which adrenaline is simply reabsorbed back into the presynaptic axon terminus through the process of endocytosis. Now, this is a relatively logical mechanism, because if adrenaline is reabsorbed back into this axon terminus, it isn't present within the synaptic cleft and therefore isn't able to bind to the receptor proteins on the postsynaptic dendrites. And not only does this allow adrenaline to be essentially infinitely recycled, but also it prevents the action potential transfer from always occurring. And there are very obvious reasons why we would want to prevent this when we recognize what adrenaline does. So when we discuss adrenaline, we should take a look at what the stimulus is that triggers the body to produce adrenaline. Now, the common popular understanding of adrenaline is that adrenaline is released when the brain recognizes physical threats. But what exactly are these physical threats? Well, one possible way to recognize this is sudden loud noises that are not predictable, that could indicate imminent danger, but also more subtle changes, such as changes in lighting conditions or even changes in temperature that often correspond to specific natural disasters, all of which lead the brain to increase production of adrenaline in the body. And the key effect that adrenaline causes are two obvious changes, one of which is an increase in heartbeat, because if the body needs to enter a fight or flight response, blood moving faster in order to transport glucose and fatty acids to increase energy production is a very valuable asset to have. And also, the rate of breathing is also highly necessary during a fight or flight response because of the need of oxygen in the production of energy. Now, one of the more subtle changes, but one of the changes that definitely makes sense, actually increases what we call your peripheral vision. So one of the ways to recognize that a fight or flight response is happening is dilation of the pupils, meaning that it looks like the darker parts of your eyes that let light in actually get larger, allowing more light in and increasing the range of what your eyes are able to see. And this enables faster reaction time, as it enables the body to recognize any of the potential threats that endanger the body's safety. Now, in terms of why adrenaline should be regulated, obviously the body cannot maintain a fight or flight level of heartbeat and a fight or flight level of breathing at a constant state, because that consumes a very large amount of energy and also potentially tires out the heart. So it's important that adrenaline have a shutoff mechanism, which again is done through the endocytosis of adrenaline and removal from the synaptic cleft in order to naturally suppress the response if it gets out of control. This concludes our series on neurotransmitters and how neurotransmitters regulate the synaptic junction between two neurons. In our final video in the series, we're going to look more in detail about systemic nervous system responses, including the sympathetic, but also the opposite response, the parasympathetic response, and how these have systemic changes over the entire body.